Let's go to Chris in Southend. Chris, hello.
Oh, it's good evening, Ian. Thanks for taking my call.
Hi.
Just want to quickly say a few things. I've worked as a truck driver for the last 5 or 6 years. I've worked for every single penny that I've earned in my life. I've never given any handouts. I do get a little bit fed up with the rhetoric in the media that somehow our productivity is the fault of work-shy, bone-idle, lazy workers, when actually that is not. A lot of it is due to poor infrastructure. I mean, I was over in Spain before the new year, and how is it they've got roads with no potholes in them, brilliant high-speed trains, and local trams and metro systems that seem to work perfectly fine. So that's what I'd say to them. But the question I'd like to say is that, and it relates actually to something that was on Tom Swarbrick's show, your colleague, that there is billions of pounds waiting to be spent on building and infrastructure projects, not just obviously roads, rails and tunnels, but, housing and, hospital wards, things like that. There's billions wrapped up in pension funds, but that money is not being spent because of the planning laws. Now, this is hindering our productivity, or lack of investment in infrastructure. So I would like to, this is the question I'd pose to the panel, what would Labour do if they got in power, which, assuming the polls are right, they are, what would they do if they got in power to modify and streamline the planning laws?
Right, Andrew Fisher. You were in charge of drafting the 2017 and 2019 manifestos. This, I guess, was a subject that you're very familiar with. Labour have talked a good game on this and on reforming the planning laws. And I've always thought, well, if Michael Gove failed as a reforming minister, how can we have confidence that Labour can actually deliver what he failed to do?
I think there are two things that are different for Labour. One is they're going to come in with a very large majority and a mandate for this. I think Michael Gove, you can judge whether he was well-intentioned or not, but the problem is there are a lot of Conservatives who have played into that kind of NIMBY kind of argument. You saw it with David Cameron even, where he virtually banned onshore wind because of the regulations he put blocking that. And you look at other countries around Europe and indeed the US who have massively expanded onshore wind in the last 10, 15 years, and we haven't. We've been left behind on that, and that's a real problem. And of course, that's true on things like housing. I think Labour will face some reaction on this. The stuff they talk about trying to have this definition between the green belt and the grey belt, which is, let's face it, about judgment, not a real thing. There is no grey belt. But there are bits of greenbelt land that aren't what you and I would think of as greenbelt.
Well, I own one bit of that land, and it's classified as greenbelt in an area of outstanding natural beauty. If any of you four came to visit me and looked at my property, you would not class it as that.
Yeah, and there is that. So some of this can be freed up. And I think part of it's necessity why Labour's doing this, because they don't want to make the argument for more borrowing. They've ruled out virtually every tax rise you can possibly have that will raise any substantial capital. So therefore, they've got to kind of do a liberalisation, deregulation kind of approach to trying to kickstart the economy. And that's what they're doing on planning. And it's pretty much all that they've boxed themselves in so much. It's pretty much all they've got. But yes, it does need to happen. We do need to build more housing. We've been well under. The last Conservative manifesto, Bob will probably know better than me, pledged to build 300,000 homes a year. They haven't even got close to meeting that in any one of the last 5 years. And that's not a particularly big target. I think the Lib Dems put 380,000 a year in their manifesto. Labour have stuck with 300,000.
Well, it's worse than that, because I'm told that in the last year, there were only 90,000 starts.
Yeah, that's right. It's gone down, actually, over the last couple of years, which
and that's
you wouldn't have
because
expected.
Michael Gove abolished the targets for local authorities.
Exactly, which again is playing into this kind of NIMBYist kind of audience, which I think Labour will have less of. But the thing is, they're going to win in seats where that is a factor, and they're going to have MPs representing those seats where they are under those pressures. They're not just urban MPs where it's not really a factor. So there will be interesting discussions, I think, and debates, and the dynamic of this will be quite interesting. But it's one of those things I think Bob was referring to. You just need to get in there and do it early.
Yeah.
And on energy as well, and on rail. I've been to Spain a lot, been to France. They've got networks of high-speed rail. We've been arguing for 15 years over one tiny line, and now we're going to build half of it. It's pretty pathetic when you look around Europe, and countries that are not as well off as we are overall in terms of size of economy have got high-speed rail networks. Not only that, they've had them for decades. It's quite embarrassing, really, that we haven't invested, which goes back to my point, actually, about borrowing to invest. You've got to make the case for that.
Bob.
I think there's interesting, serious number of points here. Interestingly, fun enough, one of the things that Spain did was it actually used very wisely the cohesion funds it got when it became a member of the EU after Franco went. Actually, a lot of the investment in Spain goes back to then. They used it very sensibly and have actually benefited from that thereafter. Second, I think we do have a problem the way the Treasury operates in the UK in terms of the business case that you have to make for major infrastructure investments and the borrowing regime for that, which is much too short-termist and actually much too restrictive as to what the overall economic benefits are. I think that's something I'd urge any new Chancellor to grip and change early on. In relation to planning specifically, there is, I'm sorry, always this big NIMBY-ish tendency that we have that pushes back. The last really major planning reform was when I was Eric Pickles Junior Minister with Greg Clark, and we brought in something called the National Planning Policy Framework, which had as its centre a presumption in favour of sustainable development, which I think was the right thing to do. It's a presumption that we should build where we can do so. Sites like yours, Ian, I think would have fitted well into that. So I think there's an important point about protecting those green areas which fulfil a green function. Maybe Greenbelt is too loose a term now to accurately encompass what's required. So maybe we could look at the definitions to more accurately represent what's on the ground. But there are some really important green areas, green buffers that separate development, habitations and so on. And the final thing I'd say to speed up infrastructure planning is we try to do that with our national infrastructure schemes. But what we haven't done is grass the nettle that they have done in France and many of the other Code Napoleon type systems, which is the land compensation regime. The reason that we get bogged down, it's fights over the planning, because that comes back down to how much am I going to get for my detriment for having this infrastructure near me. The French simply pay 1.5 times, 2 times market value, and sorry, you're going to have to take the hit for the greater good, but we're going to look after you well for having taken that hit for the broader good. We've not grasped that nettle. Maybe we should.
And also the planning departments, the local authorities have been hollowed out to such an extent. You wonder, well, OK, if there is going to be this hyperactivity, where are the planning officers going to come from?
We've got a massive shortage of planning officers at the moment.
Alice?
Yeah, I think Chris is absolutely right. And you'll know, Chris, that infrastructure is a massive drag on growth. If you take one specific project, a road project, it's the Lower Thames Crossing. It's this desperately needed crossing to the east of the Thames, to the east of London. There's no other crossing. The Dartford crossing is massively over capacity. It's been going on for nearly a decade. It's the most expensive planning application in history. On the planning application alone, we've spent more, something like £250 million, than it cost Norway to build the biggest, longest road tunnel in the world. So it's absurd. Like, the planning system is insane. It needs radical overhaul. We need to get rid of ridiculous rules about newts and environmentalists, whatever. We just need to tear it all up and start again and make sure we can build stuff, because otherwise we can't grow. And if we can't grow, we can't fund public services, and we can't have the kind of living standards that people like Chris deserve.
All because of the newts.
All because of the crested newts.
What have you got against the crested
They
newt?
hold up.
They need to be protected.
They don't. They're everywhere. They're increasingly common newt because we've protected them so much. I think we could build over some of their habitats without, ruining nature.
Goodness. Don't tweet me, tweet Alice. Joe.
I don't think they taste very nice.
Oh my God!
Water.
No, I mean my serious answer is that I expect Labour to do something very radical, actually, in the first 100 days, because it's, as Andrew articulated, it's an area where they can set out a real difference between themselves and the other government, and it's really important for them to deliver some sort of retail offering to younger voters who overwhelmingly vote Labour and who are increasingly concerned by the issue of housing. And so if you don't solve an issue, solve is perhaps too strong a word, if you aren't perceived to be addressing the issue of housing and significantly within your first 100 days, you'll be in trouble. And so I think we'll see some pretty whether they're actually radical or whether they appear to be radical remains to be seen. But